In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I had a really fascinating conversation with Caruana-McManus. Catherine is the director of Mesh, an Australian-based IoT integrator, the founder of the global community of Giant Ideas for Smart Cities, and the co-founder of the IoT Alliance. Catherine recently won an IoT Ambassador Award for Australia and Smart Cities Industry Leader at the recent Smart Cities Council Awards. Catherine has been in the cities business her whole career, and even though it wasn't called Smart Cities, she shares how she's been working in this space for 25 years. We discuss the economic imperative for cities to get smarter and more sustainable, as well as a bit about the history and evolution of smart cities as a concept over the last 30 years, from it being purely about urban development to now being acted upon at the grassroots level. Catherine has some really interesting observations about how Australia is embracing the smart city concept or smart community concept, her optimism about Australian innovation, and the opportunities we should be acting upon right now. We discuss some of the many projects Catherine is working on, as well as her takeaways from her trip to Barcelona, Amsterdam, and the UK. We finish our chat focusing on the emerging trend of the circular economy and why we should all be talking about it more. One thing I will say is that we did record this at the end of last year, so you'll hear us refer to next year in the interview, but of course that is right now 2019. You're all very smart people, so I'm sure you'll all figure it out. As always, I hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Just before we get into the episode, I wanted to let you know that you can now support the Smart Community Podcast via Patreon. That's patreon.com/smartcompod with 2 M's. If you become a patron, you'll get a special episode each month exclusive to supporters. If you would like to feature on the Smart Community Podcast, you can also head to Patreon where you can sponsor an episode. There are options for either a full featured episode or adding a promo for your company or an event coming up. There are both once-off and monthly options. Thank you so much for your support so far. It is my dream for the podcast to be self-sustaining so it can continue to be produced for my smart community no matter what the circumstances. Enough from me, on with the episode. Hello, Catherine. How are you today?
Really well, Zoe.
I am so glad to have you on the podcast. I know we've been talking about it for a while.
Well, that's right, but always better late than never. And it's been an extremely busy year. So I think, it's only onwards and upwards now for what's going to be happening next year.
Totally. I'm so excited about this conversation. So let's jump straight in. Can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
So my background, I've actually been in the cities business my entire career. I started back in the 80s, the late 80s, in local government for a local government authority in Victoria. My undergraduate's actually in urban planning and economics. And even at university, I had a passion for digital. And actually was instrumented one of the Australia's first digital land use surveys using computer-aided design and GIS. That was back in 1988.
Wow.
And then from there, I got finished my degree, and my first major entree into this sort of digital infrastructure space was with Telstra. So I came into Telstra and did a lot of work around planning and provisioning for networks. And in the mid-1990s, actually was involved in launching their internet services business. So that was launching major internet brands into the Australian marketplace. So white pages on the web, yellow pages, and actually one of the world's first geospatial location enablement portals, whereis.com. So that took me up until sort of the late 90s, and I did a short stint with my own organisation in MC Squared Consulting, and we deployed two-way satellite and communication solutions for government and an enterprise. And then that sort of took me up to the time that I got very heavily involved in IBM. So I was with IBM from the mid-2000s and was with them for nearly 10 years. And in that time, we built the Smarter Cities practice locally and globally. And so I was responsible for IBM Smarter Cities for ANZ, but that also saw me working on many, many projects internationally.
Yeah, wow. So you've been in the smart cities space for a long time now.
25 years.
Yeah, cool. Well, this next question is what sparked your interest in smart cities, but it seems like you just lived and breathed it ever since you graduated uni.
Yeah, look, I think I did. One thing that was always very aware in my sort of context, even as a child growing up, I was very interested in engineering and cities and architecture and also digital, not knowing that it was digital at that stage. But when I went to university, we started to really understand how we could actually start to build 2D and 3D models of cities. And that to me was very interesting because I had a passion for geospatial. And I think it just sort of, took an effect from that. But, when I look at the opportunity and the benefits of smart cities, it's really about converging the digital world with the physical world. And all too often governments focus on the physical infrastructure, the roads, the rail, the hospitals, the education institutions, but there's such an important role for the underlying digital infrastructure to essentially get the best value out of that physical infrastructure. So I'm an economist. That's my passion as well. I've spent, my undergraduate was in economics, and since then I've done postgraduates in applied finance. So for me, it's also the economics of the city, which I think is important, and the role that digital and technology can actually play in actually, getting return on investment, leveraging existing assets, but also looking to how we can do things smarter when we are building out new infrastructure.
What is a smart city to you?
Smart city to me is actually a mindset. It's actually not a physical thing. It's a mindset of a society that actually wants to look at things through a different lens, where they can actually collaborate across industry, research and the government sector. And it's also about a conversation. So, it starts with how could we actually do this better, and what is there for the role of new systems and thinking and technology that could lend itself for that. In some respects, the smart cities movement is interesting because as an urban planner, I was very interested in the work that people like Jane Jacobs was doing in New York, in the 60s and 70s about, the role that citizens played in looking at the tension between developers and cities and the whole aspect of that. And so I think cities that do well and that are smart are those that really embrace the philosophy and the conversation about trying to do things differently and better. And so that's my view. It's not a point solution. And actually, if we look at the history of smart cities in its, purest form, I suppose, in the 2000s, the large corporates such as Cisco, IBM, Siemens and others started to use this word smart cities. But essentially what they were focused on there were things such as intelligent transport systems. So that's your tolling systems and, intelligent rail networks, which was still very, I think, esoteric to the average person on the street. It was sort of the thing that a large, infrastructure authority focused on. They built out the infrastructure and then they tried to, embed that with some optimization capability. But I think that's changed a lot, Zoe, in the last 12 months to 2 years, where it's really started to filter down to the grassroots level. And I'm really pleased about that, particularly for someone who started off my early career in local government. And I'm just so happy that smart cities is now part of the conversation with many councils across the country, because I think they see the benefits of it being much more of a grassroots movement, as opposed to only being, in the hands of the large players.
No, I love that too. I think too, even, within the last 12 months, the movement has really shifted to that kind of grassroots level. I mean, everyone, like there's a place for kind of everyone in the conversation, which is what I'm really enjoying, how it's really shifting from, that city approach to the community approach. And like it involves those, smaller players just as much as the bigger players, and actually working together and collaborating. I'm really excited about it.
I would agree. I think that is actually the opportunity. And what I'm also seeing, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a bit more detail, but particularly with my own organisation, Meshed, which is an Internet of Things integrator, we are really leveraging open source and interoperable standards so that cities can actually take hold of this new opportunity and build more collaborative ecosystems around how they actually want to use things such as data, analytics, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. And I think that to me is really where significant opportunity lies, is where, we're starting to see, even, for example, in the sort of broader industry space, we're seeing disruption where, services such as Uber and Airbnb are really focused around a solution to a customer that wants an end outcome. And therefore, if you reduce the barriers of entry where cities can actually use technology tools and have a much more control over how they use those technology tools, then that, I think, is going to lead to innovation at the city level. And that's only going to benefit, the people who, ideally we're trying to serve in this, discussion.
So I have some more questions, but I know that we really want to talk about some of the things you've been doing. So let's quickly go to, we've already answered it, I think. Like, why is this concept so important?
I think it's important because we just can't do what we've traditionally done. We've got pressures, particularly in Australia, which are whilst there are cities all around the world growing, there are some fundamental nuances which Australia is unique. And therefore, the conversation in smart cities is really important, that we actually build out our own flavour, of this revolution and this transformation. I don't think, whilst it's really important that we look to places overseas, and we'll talk a little bit about that, Zoe, with my recent, trips to Europe and to the UK, essentially why I think it's so important right now is that let's just look, for example, at the New South Wales. New South Wales government's going to be spending, billions of dollars in infrastructure in the next 5 years. Victoria have announced, for example, large infrastructure projects. So why it is really important is that we want to make sure that those investments are considered investments, and that we plan and embed the digital part as part of those overall infrastructure projects, so that we don't have waste, so that we actually can deal with the fact that our cities are growing and we're having to deal with things such as congestion, urban heat. Just look at the last couple of weeks in Sydney and in Melbourne with weather events. That's why it's important. And I do think that the smart cities movement are a clear opportunity for us to look at how do we prepare for climate change, and how do we also look at things such as a circular economy and do it in a really succinct and accessible way.
How do you think Australia is currently embracing this concept?
To be fair, I think we were really slow. I think with the Smart Cities and Suburbs program, so that's $52 million of investment by the federal government, which is seeding out collaborations with local government and industry. That is a really amazing step in the right direction. And I am so pleased that I've chosen to actually remain in Australia and kickstart my own company, Meshed, in this environment, because I think that what we will see is that Australia actually will be a giver of technology. And I'm very optimistic. I think that in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll start to see innovations in smart cities that will actually happen in Australia and we will take globally. Let me give you some examples. The work that's currently happening in South Australia around solar and renewable energy. Organisations like Zen Energy, Australian grown, helping with regards to looking at the way in which we can actually power our cities in the future. If we look at sort of locally, just the amount of work that's being done, for example, in transport planning and in mobility, I think that there's lots of opportunities. But to say that we're at the cutting edge would probably be, pushing it a little bit too far. But I don't see any reason why we can't be. I think we've got the right ingredients, and we've just got to continue to be open to the conversation and think strategically about how, innovation, technology, new thinking and processes can actually help us move things forward and deal with the massive challenges that Melbourne and Sydney are currently dealing with.
Okay, let's jump into some of the projects and things that you're currently working on, and some of the, obviously we'll talk about, your recent trips to Europe and the UK as well. So keen to hear about your experiences at Smart City World Congress, but also Future Cities Catapult. So that's too many questions in one. Let's start with some of the projects and things you're currently working on and what you've been doing the last kind of few months.
Oh, look, that's a great question, Zoe. So myself and my team in my organisation, Meshed, we've actually been working for the last 3 years on deploying a very large-scale Internet of Things network in partnership with councils and with universities. We've been able to do that through an amazing partnership that we have with the world's largest public access Internet of Things network, known as the Things Network. And essentially what we're doing is the Internet of Things is the concept of connecting smart devices to the cloud so you can get data. So what I'm talking about here, to bring it down to the level of, layman's terms, is, things such as being able to monitor whether or not a bin is full, a lighting controller for dimming a street light, parking pods on disabled car parking, and being able to get the data off that asset and feed that so that, the city or the provider of that service can do it much more effectively. And what's been important to the meshed model is that we've really embraced open source technology. And I think it's really important to give a context to that. I've worked for very large organisations, Telstra, IBM, KPMG, and I've seen the evolution of the power of open source. And I felt 2.5 years ago, when I started to really think about Meshed and where we could actually take this organisation, what a powerful tool that would be, given the fact that local government authorities are very wanting to have more control over their data. And also, they don't have a lot of budget, so therefore their investments that they make into this technology needs to be repeatable and interoperable. So we've now got 27 councils on the network, and we are growing. We've got networks basically that stretch from Cairns in the north right down to Melbourne, Geelong and Ballarat, and as far actually as Glenelg and Victoria. South Australia, and we've just about to launch our first network in WA. So it's quite a sizable network, and the sorts of things that cities are using that network for range from air quality monitoring, flood mitigation and monitoring, smart lighting, bins, parking. But what we're also very passionate about is actually helping cities with their science, technology, engineering and maths capabilities. So we've recently launched a great program in concert with teachers who are experts in digital and providing a service to local councils where they can actually demonstrate with an Arduino or a Raspberry Pi how to actually get data off this network. And they're not just organising that for their internal staff, but we're also putting that out to communities so that when they put up one of these public access networks, everybody gets the benefit of being able to use it.
Yeah, wow, cool. That sounds really exciting. And I think bringing that back to the community approach is so important.
Well, it is. And I think that this actually is a good segue to, my recent trip to Barcelona, Amsterdam and the UK.
Yep, let's dive in.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, and just picking up your previous question, Zoe, about, where does Australia sit with this? How well are we doing? Look, a lot of cities, particularly in Europe and in Asia, have really done a lot of large projects in smart cities and the Internet of Things. And it wasn't really until the Internet of Things started to really pick up in the market that I think people could make sense of what the smart cities movement was all about. And so what I've just recently done is I've spent 2 weeks on a fact-finding mission in Europe and the UK to go and immerse myself in cities about how they're adopting smart cities and the Internet of Things, and sort of what are some of the lessons learned, but also some of the challenges of them moving forward. So the Smart Cities World Expo was held in Barcelona earlier this month, and a delegation of Australian cities and government leaders and universities attended that expo. I've actually been to that expo 7 times, and I will be fair, I didn't go last year, I went the year before, and to be frank, I didn't see anything necessarily new at the Smart Cities Expo. But what was really positive was a lot more cities participating. So it really is a mini United Nations where you go through the exhibition hall and you have, for example, the northern cities, so the Nordic cities banded together, and they had a really big, expo. You had in the Netherlands, which is always a very big expo, and you started to see also northern Europe, places like Estonia, Slovenia, and places like that also, showing their wares. And the reason why these cities are able to do that is that they really do have a culture around innovation. And I think that drives from the fact that at university, things such as STEM, science, engineering, and mathematics is very high on their agenda as a nation. And therefore, what I took out as one of the main sort of findings from the expo was just how far advanced some other regions are in the world in actually building out end-to-end applications and devices and solutions to help cities with some of their challenges.
Yeah, wow. So you were in Barcelona. Was it about a week that you were there?
Yeah, so the conference runs usually for 3 days. So that was the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And then on the Friday, we did something a little bit different, which turned out to go so well. We actually invited customers and partners to spend a day with us in Amsterdam with Things Network. So there was 10 people, a delegation of 10 people, which was great. We took them to the home of the Things Network based in Amsterdam, and that was wonderful. We had a one-on-one briefing with Johan Stoking, who is the CTO of the Things Network. And let me just put some numbers in front of you, Zoe. So this network started just on 3 years ago with no gateways, and gateways are the communications technology which is used to connect devices over very long range to send the data. They've now got 5,500 gateways around the world across, I think, 98 countries, and serving something like 12 million data packets per day. So this goes to show you just how quickly things are moving in that space. But then after that, we put people in a little bus, and we went and had a briefing with WaterNet, which is one of the largest water authorities in Netherlands. And they shared with us their wonderful programs where they're using the Internet of Things around a range of challenges. One of the most interesting was the work they're doing in rainfall catchment and management. So essentially what they're doing is collecting rainfall and then redistributing that rainfall basically as water use for the apartments and the households. But they're in the process of actually creating rooftops which will be all green. So their vision is that in the next 5 to 10 years, when you fly over Amsterdam, you'll be looking down onto completely green, which I just think is wonderful. And I really, if there's one call out I want to make on this podcast, or anybody who's listening to this, I think that Australia is ready for a rooftop revolution. You think of all the space on rooftops. They've often got the best views, but what do they do at the moment? They look after the HVAC system and all those really, industrial type, pieces of equipment. But we could actually transform cities by having greening rooftops. So that was really wonderful. And then we went to the Port of Amsterdam, and we met with the head of George, the head of innovation for the Port of Amsterdam, and he took us to the smart parking site where they're using that for the freight logistics trucks that come into the port to actually manage waiting and queuing times as they're coming in and out of the port to pick up, freight and whatnot. And then at the end of the evening, we took people back to a local boutique brewery and had what everybody in Amsterdam loves, which is beer. So it went very well.
Sounds amazing. I'm heading over to Barcelona and Amsterdam next year, so I'll need to have a chat with you about some of the awesome things that I should be going to see. My focus will be smart mobility. So looking at, yeah. Okay, cool. So we already touched on kind of what was new, which was that there's so many more, places involved and people kind of banding together. Was there anything else that kind of, excited you or surprised you at that expo?
Yeah, look, I think what was interesting was one of the most interesting sessions I attended was blockchain. So the way in which cities are actually using blockchain, and they had three very good case studies. So there was the Dubai government that have been using blockchain for end-to-end real estate transactions, which to me just makes perfect sense. You think about the biggest invested capital in any city, it's around the real estate and the property, and essentially all of the contracts and conversations and transactions that happen around property. I think that's a very good use of this technology. The other city, which I thought was really cool, was Taipei, who have been using blockchain in dealing with their number one challenge, which is air pollution and congestion. And so they have a network of air quality sensors, and they're using blockchain to verify the validity of the data, but also the validity of the device using blockchain. And I hope you don't mind, you asked me earlier what were some of the projects that we're currently working on. One of the most exciting projects that we've been working on now for 2 years, which is really gaining traction, is the Technology for Urban Livability project, the TULIP project, which we started with UTS 2 years ago. That came about when we brought Vinky Geisman out from the Things Network to do a workshop with UTS when we launched their wonderful public access LoRaWAN network, because we're using the technology LoRaWAN. And that spawned a great interest by the people in their workshop to focus around air quality. So we've actually built a sizable network in central CBD with air quality devices, and that network is now being expanded to Lake Macquarie in partnership with Lake Macquarie City Council. And that came about because people in that region are concerned about the impact of coal dust from the Hunter Valley, as well as trying to understand more about the weather and what's happening in that area as climates, are shifting. And very pleased to see that the air quality monitoring projects are also gaining traction with some other projects which will come out of the round 2 of the Smart Cities and Suburbs initiative.
Excellent. Okay, so you've been to Barcelona, then you also went to the UK. Can you tell us about some of the things that you did there and the findings that you had from the Future Cities Catapult?
Yeah, look, that was really interesting, Zoe. So I met with Sam and Gemma, who lead the Future Cities Catapult. So just to put things into perspective, the UK government has a number of what they call Catapult projects. Catapult projects are out of the traditional budget invested programs of work, focused around, obviously, competitive advantage and trying to position the UK in new opportunities. So one of which opportunity they saw was cities, and so that's the Future Cities Catapult. They also have the Digital Catapult, which is focused more around digital transformation more broadly within government and industry, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But let's talk about the Future Cities Catapult. Essentially, they're a small team, but what they do is they provide seed funding to cities and to industry to do projects around challenges. But one of the most interesting projects that they're doing is called Synchronicity, which is at the heart of it. So what it's trying to do is address this challenge of data being able to be shared between different technology systems and solutions, and also being able to be shared between cities. And how we do that through the Internet of Things is what we call open APIs, application programmable interfaces. So essentially what they've done with 7 cities, 3 in the UK and 4 in Europe, they've actually agreed on some common APIs so that the cities can actually share the data. the data could be generated from a lighting solution or an air quality solution, and that's really the whole thrust behind Synchronicity. And the great take out of that meeting was that they were very interested in what we've been doing around this air quality project, but are also looking for potential participation by Australian cities who have adopted the open and agile cities method, which is a thinking around interoperability, data sharing, and open standards. So that was a really wonderful discussion there, Zoe, and I think that there will be great interest from the UK and from Australian cities to collaborate further on that project.
Yeah, no, definitely. Sounds really interesting. And they're on my list to visit next year as well.
Well, I will certainly organise the introductions, no problems at all. Be delighted.
Thank you. That would be amazing. Okay, so any other projects and things you want to share at the moment? If not, we'll move on to integrating across different disciplines. But anything else you'd like to share in project space?
Well, one of the most exciting projects that we're working on is in people counting. And I know that sounds kind of a little bit sort of strange that a network provider would be developing solutions in people counting. But here's a proposition for you. If I had $1 for every single time I met with a city who would say to me, Catherine, one of our biggest challenges is we just don't know where people are going, and we just don't have the data. So what we've done is we've created Encounter, which is a people counting solution, and it came about in partnership with the city, Liverpool City Council in Western Sydney, where we were working together on a project trying to understand how they could provide more information to shop owners in the traditional sort of mall areas of the city. And that's really interesting because essentially the way we've done it is it's completely anonymised. It doesn't take any personal information. Essentially we're counting smartphones and other smart devices and putting some smarts around that as well, understanding that some people have more than one phone and children don't have phones. But, you know, we're getting pretty good at, you know, bringing some assumptions into the algorithm there. But what's really important about that is from that one project, we had 7 councils trial the product, and now we've gone into full production, and we've already pretty much sold out of our first commercial run. And we're hoping, because the cities own the data, albeit we help them with the platform, we're hoping that cities can really understand more about, you know, how people are actually moving and where are the activation spots for the city. But it's also very useful for things like beaches, festivals, shopping centres, and I think that links very nicely with your interests, Zoe, around mobility, because, you know, when we think about the most contested part of mobility at the moment, it's the footpath, you know, and it's looking at how do we actually promote active mobility. So if cities are struggling to provide spaces for people to move around due to congestion, then we're really not going to be able to help people in a more active, you know, transport. So we also see it very relevant in untapping some great information to help cities with their whole sort of active mobility and the mobility as a service model as well.
Yeah, definitely. And knowing where people are, but more where they're going to and from is so important, and how many people and like at what times and all that kind of stuff, because you need that information to be able to deliver a high level of service in that mobility space.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And I think that one of the opportunities is to see how we can share this data more broadly. You know, what I've seen in the shift is that, and we still have this big challenge, Zoe, is around data sharing. It's not easy, even within large organisations, to share data amongst departments. So I think, you know, by making technology more accessible, and particularly at the local government level where they really are, you know, at the cusp of it all happening, that's really what we're on a mission about, and just making it as accessible and affordable as possible. And then, you know, from that we'll see where it will go in terms of linking with other things such as weather data. So, you know, we can bring weather data into this. We can bring in, you know, events, and you start to then build a pretty good picture of what's actually happening in the city at any point of time.
So this kind of leads on to the next question, which is about integration. So even within an organisation, you need to integrate across the different, departments and disciplines, particularly with data. How do you think we can better integrate across not just within, a government or council, but across industry, government, academia? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I do think that, Australia has ranked very poorly. If we look at the indexes looking at translation of innovation into industry, we rank very poorly. Our university system here is very much geared towards the universities holding on to that information and not necessarily having the commercial skills to be able to translate that out into the market. But having said that, I think it's about finding just the right people and places. And we certainly have had no challenges in working with leading thinkers across government, universities and the private sector. And, I would encourage anybody listening to this that it actually isn't that difficult. It's a matter of picking up the phone and having the conversation. And I think what's also helped is that with funding arrangements as well, the government programs around the CRC, so there's a thing called the Cooperative Research Centres, that's where the federal government allocates millions of dollars in supporting new innovations into industry in areas of competitive advantage. They really have changed a lot of the criteria now that the research institutions involved need to have industry sponsors, and you need to be able to translate the innovation much more, quickly, into the market. But let's not forget that in the space of infrastructure, 95% of infrastructure and services delivered to citizens is actually undertaken by the private sector. So even in hospitals are outsourced, schools, we've got different ways in which we deliver, for example, education. So therefore, what's important for Australia is to actually support business in an innovation agenda. And this is where I think as an Australian governments have really done very poorly, and we haven't necessarily been able to keep consistency around the emphasis on, supporting areas which are going to lead to innovation. And that's about investment in STEM, in schools. It's also about ensuring that organisations, startups and small to medium enterprises who want to build organisations and capability in Australia adequately supported to do that. Here's the thing out of the Future Cities Catapult. They actually, I went to Bristol and went to the makerspace in Bristol, and the Bristol City Council actually doesn't charge any rent for any new business that wants to set up in Bristol that actually is aligned. They've got 3 categories: creative arts, technology and education. And essentially what they see is they repurpose basically buildings and spaces, and they ask the market to come up with business models that can actually help them to attract those sorts of businesses. So, I think that there's opportunities here, and even in my own organisation, it's really difficult to find vibrant, places for people to build out that potential next smart city solution that could take on a global market.
Interesting. Okay, the next question is about emerging trends. So I'm keen to hear your thoughts based on your experiences. But what do you think the emerging trends are that people aren't talking about enough?
The circular economy. I think that next election is going to be, I'm hoping, a watershed moment. I think that we've got to just get real about the fact that even if you deny that climate change is happening, it still doesn't hurt that we don't harm the planet any further. And I think that that's really simple stuff. It's about understanding more about our water life cycle and how we can actually reuse water. It's about greening rooftops. It's about trying to, reduce the impacts of growth on cities by enabling more green infrastructure. And I think that's really important. And I think we've got to a point now where the world is looking to places like Australia to innovate and to lead in this space. I mean, Australia is the most irradiated country in the planet. There is no other planet in the earth that can achieve the outcomes of solar capability than anywhere else in the world. we should be world leaders in this whole space around solar. We're also starting to see some really interesting work being done, for example, in renewable hydrogen. The ability to convert, solar to renewable hydrogen. And I think that is one of the greatest opportunities for our cities, is to embrace the circular economy. And it doesn't have to be necessarily at a massive scale. It could be at a building scale and at a precinct scale. And I do want to commend actually the Smart Cities Council of Australia, and in particular Adam Beck, who's come from a background with the Green Buildings Council and sustainability, where essentially what we're doing, and also in partnership with Lisa McLean from the Open Cities movement, which is a consortium of like-minded organisations that really want to shift the needle around next generation infrastructure. And essentially what that's going to look like is, at the precinct level, how can we actually make the whole sort of building and precinct more sustainable? And I think it's a really exciting opportunity. So I don't really have anything else to add. I think we've got to get really focused around the circular economy. And if we were to do that, I think we could really, transform our cities, and certainly I think address some of the pain points we're seeing today.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Smart cities, smart community, circular economy should just be part of that conversation. It shouldn't be an add-on. We should be talking about it just as much as how we can utilize technology, or use technology as that enabler to make our economy more circular. And I think it's not being talked about enough. You're definitely right.
And just to build on that, in order for us to engage around where future work and future opportunities are going to reside, it also means that we have to understand that there will be implications of things such as automatics and artificial intelligence and robotics, but it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. And I think that if we prepare our society to embrace the capabilities around new value-added services in this new digital space, we will actually thrive. And, the reality is, if we look at history, look at the Industrial Revolution, there's always been step change. We had the steam and we had the coal, and we had all of this happen in terms of industrialisation. We are absolutely at that point now. And I think the opportunity is, how willing and how far do we want to take it? And I'm really hoping that even the most conservative individual out there will see the benefits for themselves about how we could actually have much more sustainable cities and communities. And I think that it doesn't have to be one or the other. I do believe that it's definitely a transition, but investment in the right spaces is really important now. And it's not the time to be, pitting one up against each other. I think that's really not helpful at all.
Yeah, I agree. I think collaboration over competition, and we don't really, like you said, we don't really have a choice. We're at the tipping point now where if we don't start looking after our planet, okay, maybe we can move to Mars with Elon, but that's not really a sustainable solution. So I think it's so true, and that's what we can really use smart communities for. It's not just about automating everything, but it's making things more efficient, more effective, and more sustainable in all purposes of the word, which is environmental, economy, and social. So we need all those three to make sure that we can move forward in this space. Otherwise, things are just going to get worse, and if we don't act now, then we won't be able to come back from it, but without the doom and gloom. But I think you're totally right with, embracing that technology. But the biggest thing is that if we're involved, then we create what that future will be. I think people are very worried about this dystopian future. Well, okay, let's get involved and make sure that that doesn't happen. I think that's really important as well. And really, we need to be involved in the conversation, whichever way it's going, so we can shape it.
Exactly right. So let's look at an immediate low-hanging fruit that we can shape: waste. The reality is that as a society, we're a wasteful society, and we can do better than that. So let's look really hard and fast at the way that we can start to eliminate waste out of society, and what are the things that we need to understand. Well, you know what we need? We need data. We need to know how quickly bins are filling. We need to know what the composition of those bins are. We need to understand how quickly our waterways are filling with plastics. This is where things such as the smart cities and the Internet of Things can actually help solve the problem. And essentially, if we get the data and we start to publish the data and we start to share the data, then basically governments and policy leaders are able to make a decision based on evidence-based analysis. They're not making a decision on knee-jerk reactions. And I think this is where we've got a really solid opportunity to look at, as a society, how do we actually shift the needle on waste? I think the supermarkets have got a lot more that they can do in this space. I mean, I couldn't believe it, Zoe. I walked into a supermarket in England, and I think it was Waitrose. I could be wrong. Maybe it was Sainsbury's. Actually, it was Sainsbury's. I will say that. It was Sainsbury's. They had individual broccoli wrapped in plastic. This is crazy. What's wrong with putting the broccoli, up on the bench and people just grabbing a piece of broccoli and putting it in their recycled, string bag? So why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because local governments and cities are actually, at the beginning of this. They're the ones that have got to deal with the problem around waste. And what I'm really encouraged is that councils, in partnership with the private sector, are now looking at waste to energy. They're looking at ways in which to better sort and manage waste. And then, of course, we're looking at understanding how we can also do a lot more education in the community around, do you really need to grab that straw or that plastic cup? Is there a better way?
Awesome. It's been so great to chat with you, Catherine. Thanks so much for coming on to the podcast. And I'm glad that you touched on, the circular economy. Well, we talked a lot about circular economy because I think it's so important and it needs to be part of the conversation. I've been having a lot of conversation with people around waste. So, water waste, energy waste, all these type of things. And it's just about, and it has to be part of the smart city conversation. It's not about technology. It's about what technology can, enable us to do to, I guess, make a better future for ourselves, or, make sure that we aren't going down this rabbit hole of dystopia.
Well, look, if there's only one last comment, I would say, please go and have a look at thethingsnetwork.org. If you haven't looked at it, have a look at it. And just immerse yourself in this capability that is a global revolution around democratizing the Internet of Things. And I think that we can embrace this new opportunity, and we can do this in partnership. And I'm very, very excited and pleased to be, I think, at a time in Australians' history where we can really make something great. And I also want to thank, there's too many people to thank, but, my journey in smart cities has only been possible because I've had amazing leaders throughout my career. And, I feel very strongly that, there's a lot of people involved in this movement locally. And, I don't want to single anybody out in particular because there's so many fabulous people. So let's embrace it. I think 2019 is going to be fabulous. And I really, hope that we'll also see a transition to a much more sustainable economy. And that's really what I think we're all focused on to move things forward.
Yeah, excellent. So I just have one last question, which is, how can people connect with you?
On LinkedIn. So my name is Catherine Caruana-McManus. So Caruana-McManus. The best way to connect with me is on LinkedIn, but also have a look at facebook.com/Smart Cities IoT. So that's a global community, and we publish, things that are happening in the smart cities and IoT space. So, either LinkedIn or whatnot, and more than happy to connect and have a conversation.
Perfect. Thanks so much. We'll put the links in the show notes so people can click away. Thanks again for coming on to the Smart Community Podcast. Such a great conversation, and I know we will have a lot more conversations in the future.
Thank you, Zoe. Thanks for your time.
No worries. Talk soon. Bye. Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community or find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter @SmartComPod. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears, so thank you in advance. As always, I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.